Welcome back to Between the Rows, a Be Hero podcast. I'm Itai, your host, and thanks for tuning in. In each episode, we're going to be talking to people shaping the future of agriculture, pollination, and sustainability. From the field to the boardroom, we're diving into the work, the challenges, and the innovation driving ag forward. I'm Itai, like I said, and today's guest is Danny Feuvre. Thanks for joining. Danny is the CEO of Australian Honeybee Industry Council and Deputy Chair of AgriFutures Australia. Danny is a prominent voice in Australia's honeybee industry, deeply involved with biosecurity, pollination, and ag innovation. Our episode is called Pollination Around the World, and we're diving into bee shortages, varroa mite challenges, crop pollination, and what the future holds for ag innovation in Australia. So let's dive in. Again, Danny, thank you for doing this.
Oh, thanks for having me. Good to see you again.
For taking the time. Yeah, absolutely. I want to start by talking about your personal journey and a bit of industry leadership, how you got into it. Can you briefly kind of tell us your story? How did you end up leading the Australian Honeybee Council and later AgriFutures?
Yeah, sure. So I was a commercial beekeeper for 15 years, based out of Yorke Peninsula, where we are today. I ran an operation that at its peak was running about 3,000 colonies with a lot of staff and trucks and utes and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was very heavily involved and focused on pollination as a big part of my business, but we're also making honey. Throughout that period, over the 15 years, I was pretty heavily involved with the state association and state politics, trying to progress the state industry forward. And as I was involved in that, I was a delegate to the national body, AHBIC, and eventually on the board of AHBIC. And then I took on an acting CEO's role whilst we were looking for a new CEO at one point in 2022. And then we went through a recruitment process, which I was successful in getting. So became CEO of AHBIC in 2022. And at the same time, I, prior to that, joined the board of AgriFutures and have been there for, I'm just about to finish my second term at AgriFutures, so just a bit over 5 years.
I want to jump with you maybe right into the heart or the belly of the beast. Right now, one of the biggest challenges that we're experiencing in Australia is bee shortages. Right, we're filming this in a really nice canola field. Right now we're not seeing any bees, but maybe later in the day or when the bloom gets a bit more prominent. But I want to ask you, first of all, maybe how growers are facing the shortages from what you're hearing around and from your experience, and what do you think or do you know caused the shortages that we're experiencing right now?
Perhaps I'll start about perhaps the why we're seeing some shortages this year. So
Sure.
In Australia, our almond industry mobilises about 300,000 colonies to service the almond crops each year. In Australia, we have about 850,000 colonies nationally. Now, we have strict biosecurity rules within Australia. That means that we can't bring bees from certain areas to other areas and back again. The eastern seaboard, so Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, we consider as one biosecurity zone, and so bees can move across those, but there are different jurisdictions and there are some movement regulations that are quite challenging for beekeepers to navigate. So we are able to draw on where the majority of the hives are in Australia. So they all congregate to almonds each year. Over the last decade or more, that demand from the almond industry has increased. And we're not expecting that to slow down anytime soon. More plantings go in and more demand. So we see all those bees moved. Over the last 12 months, we've had a record drought through South Australia and affecting Victoria as well. That has produced what is, in living memory, the worst honey crop for beekeepers in South Australia and the worst conditions to keep good bees in South Australia. And that's similar for parts of Victoria. So we're seeing drought through the southern regions, which has created really poor, weak bees over winter coming into almonds. And then, of course, in New South Wales, we're just starting to see the effects of varroa mite that's really taking hold in the feral bees, really starting that reinfestation. We've got beekeepers that are just learning how to deal with varroa mites. This is probably the first winter where they really had high pressure from mites on their bees. So they're opening their bees in July as well, and some of them are being surprised by the amount of mites in their hives, which has also weakened those colonies. So we've got a bit of a perfect storm happening. Environmental conditions with drought, as well as dealing with varroa in New South Wales. And that's created a lot of surprises for beekeepers. A lot of beekeepers are short on where they thought they'd be with bees. They're weaker than they thought they'd be as well. And so it's created a bit of a problem this year.
Right. I just want to remind maybe some of our beekeeper listeners that in Australia, we're on the other side of the year. Yes. So essentially when you're saying opening the hives in July and finding varroa mites or high levels of varroa, it's like saying in the US to open hives in January,
yes,
basically, and find high levels of varroa. Perfect. And when you look at all these problems, and obviously this is the first year that we're seeing this specifically, right? You told me earlier when we were driving here that this is like the perfect storm. The drought together with the new issue with varroa that was just introduced into Australia a couple of years ago. What do you think growers can do in order to overcome those challenges this year and also looking into the future?
Yeah, look, I think it really boils down to communication between the grower and the beekeeper, so there's no surprises. It's about the beekeeper looking early and making some honest assessments of where they think they're going to be in July, coming up to almonds, but also about the grower communicating early enough that they fully understand where they're going to be at the start of pollination as well. And if we can form that really good, close relationship between the grower and the beekeeper with open, clear communications, there's no surprises coming into almonds. And we're seeing that happen really well with some growers, but we are also seeing that in some scenarios where it's not been great, that communication. And then growers are caught out and they're desperate trying to find bees, and no one wants to be in that situation. It's not good for the beekeeping industry and it's not good for the growing industry. We're also traditionally been very much on handshake agreements in our industry, whether it be on honey flows or for pollination. And I think we're starting to see a shift in that space where a lot more growers and beekeepers are engaging in contracts that have clauses around expectations and what they're expecting to see when they come into almond pollination. And that's also a good thing for our industry. And then thirdly, we're starting to see some new players in the space. So some new brokers entering the industry, some other new emerging brokers and other emerging corporate beekeepers, some bigger beekeepers, which are also sort of shaking up the way the beekeeping industry has been operating. Right. And it's been good disruptive for the industry.
Yeah. And obviously we can't control the weather yet. But what type of strategies do you see that can be implemented in order to prevent these type of shortages? So, okay, good communication is going to be something that will help everybody understand where they stand, but how can we avoid that situation to begin with?
Yeah, we'll talk about innovation and controlling the weather. That'd be fantastic. We can make it rain whenever we need it to do.
Let me just write it down.
That's right.
You know, I ordered my crystal ball on Amazon not too long ago, so that I can at least tell the future.
Yeah, look, drought. It's about building resilience, and that's a bit of a buzzword. Resilience. What does it really mean? It's making sure that, because we know we're going to see more of these events moving forward into the future, and we've had plenty in the past.
You're right.
And so it's about making sure beekeepers can plan for that. But there are technologies around that can help us monitor. As that technologies like Bee Hero evolves and develops over time, they might have a bit more ability to be able to predict based on the hive behaviour about what it's going to happen in the future, so we have more accurate predictions of what the bees look like going into almonds. But really, it just comes down to those relationships, professional, open communication with the growers and beekeepers that are going to prevent it. We can do a lot of stuff around nutrition, hive management, varroa management, and that's great. It really lifts the bar in terms of the industry's ability to cope with some of these things, but there's always going to be surprises. Yeah. And this is just one of those years where we've just been caught out with a surprise.
That's the way agriculture is, right? Every day is something else. If we're talking about varroa, then I want to go a little bit earlier on the timeline and ask you about, when it just arrived into Australia, what was the initial response of the Australian government, the beekeeping industry, and so on? How was it? And also, I would like to know if you think that the response was good, or there are things to learn from it and to improve in the future.
Everything we do, we should be able to learn from, and the varroa response is no different. Lots of learnings to take out of that. Was it a great response? It was as good as we could do. Nothing's ever perfect. And when we're in uncharted territory, which is where we were, there was a lot of decisions made under pressure, and there's a lot of improvements we could have made. But if I just go back to the initial response and what was the mood in the industry, it was shock and horror. We've always been told it's not a case of if, but when we get varroa, so it wasn't unexpected. But I think how we found it was unexpected. We'd always thought, and all of the science and the risk assessments had always told us that we would find this at a port of high risk, coming in off a ship or equipment. But in fact, the port surveillance hives were just the canary. There was much bigger populations of mites further inland. And that sort of caught us a bit by surprise. In Australia, we have a biosecurity system that is really good. And we have a number of layers of biosecurity and who's responsible for those layers. So pre-border, border, post-border type of arrangements and on-farm. When there's an incursion, it enacts a deed that a number of industries are signatories to, and it identifies who would be the affected parties. So should you not be able to eradicate the pest, what industries does that affect? Those industries then get a say around the table about what's going to happen, but they also contribute to the cost of the program. So in this response, we had 26 parties, 26 affected parties, including government and industry, sitting around the table making decisions. So you can imagine how hard that would have been to get decisions out and how slow that is. Some of those decisions around finances had to be unanimous, not by consensus. So a lot of work in educating, getting people to understand the pest, the impacts, the cost. All the while, there's a response occurring, trying to eradicate the pest. With the system we operate in, it's very prescribed about what happens. And that's what happened in the varroa response. It stuck to that prescribed process of what happens in a biosecurity response. But this ended up being the biggest plant biosecurity response in Australia's history. So there was a lot of stuff happening that the rule book hadn't been written for as well. So a lot of having to check back with the deed, legal advice, setting up compensation and all that sort of stuff for beekeepers. And so, there was absolutely lots that could be improved. But people have also got to understand just the level of input that was had by all 26 parties. And this just wasn't a bee industry thing. This is much bigger than the bee industry.
Okay, I got it. This camera just shut off, I think, because it's in the sun.
Got too hot?
Okay, yeah, I'll just move it here. Okay, this should be okay. So since varroa basically got into Australia, there were many changes in the ways that you deal with it at present, right? Every step of the way. And in the beginning, hives were not allowed across state borders. Now there's a bit more ability to move, especially when we're talking about Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria. South Australia was closed until recently. Now with almond pollination and shortages, I think they opened it or somewhat opened it. But maybe talk about some of the measures that have been taken so far to prevent the spread. And maybe what is planned for the coming future.
So I talked about the prescribed process we go through with our biosecurity responses. Part of that is the timeline. So they do what they call a delimiting assessment. So they try and find out how far has it spread, and then make an assessment about whether it's eradicable or not. Then they try to eradicate over a period of time. And then eventually there's a set of triggers and a decisions made by those 26 affected parties about whether it's technically feasible to eradicate or not. And it's really easy to sit in hindsight and look back and say, you know what, it was never achievable, whatever. But at that point in time, based on the information that they had, those people sitting around the table had to make really quick decisions. So they made a decision in September of 2023 that was technically no longer feasible to eradicate. And from that point, the process then moves to a transition to management. Typically in our process that we only get 12 months to transition, and transition is about allowing funding to help the industry get up to speed with how to manage a new pest. We were very lucky to be able to lobby to have a 2-year window for that, and a significant amount of money to provide education and extension to beekeepers. So we've rolled out 110 workshops across the country through the Transition to Management program. There's been 30 extension officers spread around the country to really make sure that beekeepers had the opportunity to seek out the information to learn how to manage the pest. As part of that transition to management, there was a mandate agreed to by all the parties that we wanted to try and slow the spread. We knew we couldn't prevent it. We agreed that we were going to live with this, but we wanted to slow the spread to buy enough time for beekeepers to get up to speed and understand how to manage it, and so we could learn from the initial incursion in those areas how to manage it and roll that out across the country. In Australia, we've got states, as you described, and state borders. We're a federated model, so each of the states have their own government. They have their own legislation, their own rules that they have to adhere to. They have their own biosecurity sections, and a lot of those states have legal obligations to prevent pests from entering their state as well.
Right.
So when we talk about trying to slow the spread, the only real levers we have to try and do that are the borders for each state. And whilst the borders have never been, they've all been dealt with differently, the attempt has been to try and slow it spreading to other states progressively, trying to find the balance between slowing the spread but enabling business continuity. And that's not just pollination or almonds, that's all pollination. So all 15 or 16 pollination dependent industries that we deal with, and also the beekeepers themselves, because our beekeepers travel huge different distances for honey. Do we get that perfectly right? No, there's been lots and lots of challenges
of course,
with this model, but we have slowed the spread as well. So we're now over 3 years since it was first found, and arguably here before that, and we've still largely got it concentrated in New South Wales, with it only just spreading to other states. The rest of Australia is still free. Considering the amount of movement we have with our beehives, it has definitely slowed the spread. And so we've been very clear that it's about slowing the spread and not preventing the spread.
Okay. Yeah, you just mentioned the 15 or 16 different industries that rely on bees for pollination. Can you talk about some of the changes that you've seen over the past few years in those industries? Obviously, almonds is being pollinated right now, but some of the big ones are seed canola, avos, macadamias that are changing pretty. That industry changes pretty quickly.
Yeah. So when I say 15 or 16 industries, they're the ones that are signatories to our deed, our biosecurity deed. There are more outside of that are just not party to that biosecurity arrangement. Yeah, you're right. It's an evolving landscape, right? So agriculture is expanding in Australia. We are moving towards much higher value, intensified agriculture, particularly in the horticultural sector. So we've seen a huge increase in almonds over the last few years, and that has sort of slowed, but it's still increasing in size. But now we're starting to see other crops like macadamias, you mentioned, a really high value crop that we've just seen huge expansions of through southern Queensland, northern New South Wales.
Almost doubled in the last few years?
Yeah, and a lot more going in. Blueberries is another great example. Blueberries are now the largest export horticultural crop out of Australia. Huge amount of value in that crop. Concentrated in areas all under protected cropping, but all require pollination as well. So we're seeing competing crops that need honeybees, and they all flower around the same time. And so we're seeing a big pinch on supply of hives, which has contributed to the almond issue we've seen this year, because blueberries are flowering right now. Guys are preparing for macadamias and avocados. And so there are growing opportunities for beekeepers. In terms of those industries themselves, there's been varying degrees of understanding of their pollination dependency. Typically when their pollination dependency is tied to a bill, something that costs, which the varroa response was tied to how dependent are you on honeybees, the dependency is really low. But we're starting to see that the recognition now that they are starting to come around and think about, well, what does the future look like for those guys when varroa's taken hold in Australia and the feral bee population has disappeared, those wild European honeybees in the landscape, once they're out of the landscape, what impact's that going to have on their crops? And now we're starting to have those conversations. Slightly reactive, but at least they're listening. And we're going to see, I think, in the next 12, 24 months, some real recognition of the contributions honeybees makes to those crops.
Absolutely. And this year it seems interesting because almonds are obviously flowering is a bit late, maybe 8 or 10 days late than the average. And people are talking about macadamias being a few weeks early this year. So I think that is probably going to create a bit of stress for hives that are supposed to be moving from almonds into macs later in the year. But I guess we'll see. Do you think that grower attitude changed towards pollination over the last few years?
I think with varroa in the country, it received a huge amount of media attention. Everyone loves honeybees, and when the industry's under threat, like it has been with varroa, it's really made the headlines. We've made mainstream media in the big cities. And so there's not too many people that you talk to that aren't aware that we've been battling with varroa. So it's really put it at the forefront of the minds of a lot of people that would not normally think about honeybees. And that's true for growers, right? So the growers have started to stop and think about, oh, yeah, I do sort of need bees, and I do see the bees through my orchard, and I don't normally get managed bees. Well, they're coming from feral bees. Oh, they're saying we're going to lose all that. So they are starting to really think about that. And we're seeing in these new plantations, honeybees and pollination being considered a real risk to expansion. And so it gets elevated in their plans as well about not only are they considering about where they're going to get the water from, but where are they going to get honeybees from as well. And so we are seeing that change in recognition about just how important it is about considering where their pollination is coming from.
Okay. And here we have a bee flying around us right now. Australian honey prices also kind of fluctuated pretty heavily in the last year or two. I should say maybe plummeted. And why is that? I mean, there's less honey because of the drought, and at the same time the honey prices are down. I'm just trying to understand how does that work?
Yeah, so when I started beekeeping, we're getting paid $2.80, $3.20 a kilo farm gate bulk per kilogram, and that fluctuated over the 15 years to a peak of $6.50 a kilo, which has sat out for quite a few years, and now it's come back down to that $4.20 to $4.50 a kilogram bulk price. What it does tell me is that our market for honey is really supply sensitive. Every year we have a high production year, the price is influenced down. When there's a drought, it starts going back up again. Honey, as we all know, can sit in IBCs or on the shelf in inventory for quite a while. So when you have a big stockpile of it, it takes a little while to get that stockpile depleted before they start looking for more honey, and we see that price reflected. So what we saw was the price go up to record highs, $6.50 a kilo. We've seen a lot of people enter the industry because it was quite profitable at that. So over the last 5 years, we've seen over 200,000 more hives in our national headcount, so a third more beehives than what we normally have. They're all producing honey, half of those recreational and half are commercial, but all producing honey. At the same time, we're seeing record low exports. We're exporting less honey than we have since the 1960s. We've been slowly decreasing our exports.
Maybe because the prices were very high compared to the...
Not competitive, and perhaps not differentiating our honey from other honeys in the global marketplace. At the same time, we've got imports coming in the country. Now in the drought of 2012-13, imports started coming into the country, but they're pretty stable. Have fluctuated a little bit, but on average about 8,000 tonnes. And that 8,000 tonnes was coming in when our honey prices were at $6.50, right? So we were still importing honey then, and we are now. What has changed is the global honey prices decreased. We're seeing much cheaper honey coming in the country. We're not necessarily seeing more volume, but it is lower value, and it's sitting on the shelf of a much lower price compared to our Australian honey. and that creates a problem. But we're also seeing this additional honey in the system from the 200 extra thousand hives, but we haven't as an industry invested in maximising our market or expanding our market. So we're trying to jam all this extra honey into the existing market, and then we wonder why we become supply sensitive.
Yeah. So you reckon with the lower crop of honey that we're seeing this year, it might influence the prices positively in the next few months?
Look, that would be my hope, and it would be a very brave man who would get on camera and say their prices are going to go up. But if you follow that logic around supply and demand of honey, logic would say that we should see a decrease in the national inventory, and we should see a increased demand for honey, which would result in an increased price. I'd hope so. And if we don't, as an industry, with varroa on our doorstep now, we will really struggle because our beekeepers are at the cost of production.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about your beekeeping side of understanding. And I want to move maybe a bit more high level agriculture in Australia. And I want to ask you, how do Australian growers and beekeepers, by the way, deal with new technology adoption?
Yep.
Are they relatively very open to it, or quite the other way around? And maybe the growers and the beekeepers, you can't really talk about them in the same sentence because they adopt things in a different way. But I would be happy to hear your thoughts about that.
So I'll start at a high level with agriculture and growers in Australia. And so Australian agriculture isn't subsidised by our government at all. It's one of our champions, our flagships for Australian agriculture. We do it ourselves, and we're competitive on a global setting. As a result, and the reason they don't subsidise is it forces growers to become efficient in the way they grow things. So our growers arguably are some of the most efficient growers in the world. And they're some of the most innovative in the world too. So whilst places like Israel is a hub of new ag tech coming out and innovation, Australia has a good long history of producing some really innovative products here. Whether it be just farmers tinkering in a shed and building a new piece of equipment to solve a problem, or whether it's someone like Swarm Bots who have autonomous tractors running around the paddock that are, world first type of technology,
right.
Or whether it's, we've got some of that in the bee industry with sensors coming in. So we do have a culture of innovation in agriculture. In terms of adoption, that's been studied a lot. We have our early adopters who are always chomping at the bit to take on the new bit of technology and trial it and test it. And then we have our normal set of adopters who will look over the fence to see someone else try it, and if it works, then they'll adopt it. And then our tail end who no matter what you do, you'll have to drag them kicking and screaming along with you for the ride.
Right.
So how does that work in the bee industry? I'd say the bee industry is probably a little bit behind the rest of agriculture. Beekeeping hasn't really evolved in decades and decades. I've always said one of the most innovative things the bee industry's done in Australia is put bees on pallets and move them with forklifts, right? Really
I always
some efficiency.
I always say that the last big innovation or disruptive innovation to beekeeping was the invention of motorized vehicles.
Yep. And so, look, there's technology just starting to enter the space in the last couple of years, trying to solve some of the problems. Arguably, Bee Hero is probably one of the most advanced or well-backed and well-tested products coming to Australia, but there is a huge amount of other technology here.
Right.
Arguably, have they solved the problem that they're trying to set out to solve? I'd say probably not quite yet. So I don't think there's anything that's readily available off the shelf that beekeepers can adopt at a commercial scale just yet. A lot of it's still in development. A lot of hope in what's there. It looks really good, but still got that research and development piece and commercialisation piece to go. Very much in the startup ag tech space, which is incredibly hard to play in, as you would know, and challenging. So I think a lot of beekeepers are sitting and waiting and watching, just waiting to see and waiting for those early adopters to try the technology, let them fix out, get all the bugs out of the systems, and let them show those other beekeepers that it works, and then I think we'll get some more adoption. I don't see any hard barriers in our industry. As long as the technology is solving a problem that will improve the bottom line of a beekeeper, I think there's plenty willing to take up the challenge and adopt it. but I just don't think it's quite there yet.
Yeah, I will say that from my perspective, we are witnessing from the beer perspective. I mean, we are witnessing exactly what you described. There's definitely a very high interest within the grower community of tech and innovation. I think it also has to do with the fact that a lot of the growers here are very corporate-minded growers. They're big entities with owners and board members and people that you need to answer to and show and show reports to, and so on and so forth. And we thoroughly enjoy working here in Australia. It's very different than what we're used to from the US and other places that we've been working at. And yes, it's definitely an experience. It's not. I'm not saying that it's easy. There are always many challenges, and definitely there's still a lot of development on wherever you look. There's a lot of development that needs to be made in order to solve all the issues. But look, once we solved all the issues, it's going to be just boring.
Yeah, that's right.
We still need the
on to the next challenge.
Yeah, exactly. Can you share an example of innovation here in Australia? It doesn't have to come specifically from Australia, or maybe something that was brought from other places, but an example for innovation that really significantly changed the way agriculture is being conducted, or, you know, just really influenced agriculture and the level of efficiency.
Oh, look, there's just so much. I mean, if you just want to look at some homegrown technology, you know, Wi-Fi, right? Wi-Fi was developed in Australia, yeah? And so that has changed farms as well.
Absolutely.
They've got connectivity now. They're able to run, data streaming on their tractors and headers and all that sort of stuff, and bring all that information back and analyse it and improve their farming. There's just a huge amount of innovation globally that we are just at the cusp of on farming, that we're really, I think, in the next 5 or 10 years going to see that take off on farming, and really see the fruit of the labour that's been put in over the last 10 years, trying to develop those technologies to build those efficiencies on farm. And I think it's just going to be exponential, that growth in gains we're going to see. And that will be true for the beekeeping industry too. Like what I'm seeing now is right at the start of the ag innovation in
Right.
beekeeping, and I think the benefits are going to be huge, and we're only just at the start of it.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that you don't really see a barrier, right? That innovation in Australia is something that can grow and grow, and people want it as long as it works and it provides value. So I'm not going to ask you about how to overcome barriers if there are none, but what new innovators and people that are coming up with new inventions should have in mind as they're exploring the idea of going into the Australian ag industry? When I say ag, I mean beekeeping as well as part of it. But
so what I always say to startups that I'm talking to and inventors is, don't try and solve a problem that you think is a problem. Go to the grower or the beekeeper and find out what the problem is, then try and solve it. Often you'll see someone come up with a really bright idea that they think is solving a solution, and then trying to push it onto a beekeeper or a grower, and it's not actually solving anything for them. And then that is a battle.
Yeah, in the startup world, there is this question of, is it a solution looking for a problem, or you actually have a problem that needs a solution?
Yeah, agree. And so that's the key. In terms of going back to your barriers, like I was suggesting perhaps in the adoption space, that I think in the beekeeping industry, there's people willing to adopt technology if they could see it solving the problem for them.
Absolutely.
There's still plenty of barriers for startups, none more so than perhaps funding and investment in Australia, because we find that really hard in Australia to get startup money and venture capitalist money into ag tech in particular. And I don't have the solutions for that. But in the bee industry, I really think that the innovators have got to be connected with the beekeepers, got to be connected with the growers, and understand their problems before finding those solutions.
Right. We're getting closer to the end of the conversation, and I want to ask you maybe a bit about some of the differences that you have seen between beekeeping here and beekeeping in America specifically. I'm sure you've visited, I'm sure you've been in touch with many leaders of the American beekeeping industry. And I just, from your experience and what you have seen, what stands out as like the biggest differences between these two sister industries?
Sure. So they operate a lot different in the US to the way we do in Australia. So we've really looked to the New Zealand model, particularly around varroa, right? So as soon as we got varroa, the first thing we did was start looking abroad to see what happened when they first had incursions, what was the behaviour of the beekeepers, what was happening to the feral bees. And of course, the US, we looked to that country to try and find some examples. And look, they have a model, which I'm not sure is going to work in Australia, which is very much industrial beekeeping and chasing year-round pollination. We just don't have that opportunity in Australia. But having said that, we have looked really closely at how they've managed varroa mites. What lessons can we take out of varroa mites management and apply in Australia? And I think the big difference is when varroa came into the US 50 odd years ago, the options weren't there. You didn't have the tools in the toolbox to manage it. The difference for Australia is that we've got a mite that doesn't appear to be resistant to any of the chemistry. And so we have a pretty big toolbox to be able to deal with this compared to the US. So we don't need to be abusing a particular chemical and exhausting it and then moving on to the next one. And
a lot of beekeepers around the world are jealous just listening to what you're saying right now.
And I don't think that's something our beekeepers are really hearing or realising, that we have an opportunity to have a toolbox full of tools for a long period of time if we manage it appropriately.
Exactly.
If we go down the same path and we don't learn from the US in terms of just overusing a particular chemistry because it's easy or cheap, and then it builds resistance, and then we've lost it, right? So I think that for me is the real key lesson that we need to look at out of the US, is about that rotation of chemicals for varroa treatments to make sure we keep that toolbox full. I think there's a lot of things that we can learn around hive husbandry and management that they do in the US, probably not to the same scale. I mean, you've got beekeepers over there that are 100,000 hives, right? Like our biggest beekeeper in Australia is 12, 13,000 colonies.
Right.
Different model we operate in. But there's still a lot of stuff that our beekeepers are gleaning from the US. So we've constantly got beekeepers going over to the US, particularly into Canada as well, to go and learn about how they're managing mites, but how are they breeding for tolerance, how are they managing queens, how are they splitting, how are they treating. There's been a lot of interest around cold storage.
Right.
That really excites a lot of Australian beekeepers, believe it or not, when we have stinking hot summers. But as an opportunity over winter for varroa management and other diseases. So there's a lot of guys looking at that as well. So there's just, I think the worst thing we could do is put our blinkers on as an industry and just focus internally on ourselves and not look to the rest of the world who have been managing mites forever.
Absolutely. I mean, this is really interesting. You already answered my next question, which was going to be, what can the Australian beekeeper learn from their American counterparts? So you already answered that, but so I want to turn this question around and ask you, what do American beekeepers can learn from Australian beekeepers, you think?
It depends on whether they want to learn from Australian beekeepers, I think is probably the big question. Look, I think we produce a lot of honey in Australia per hive,
right?
And I think there's some lessons there. My experience in the US is I'm not that confident that what they're doing is sustainable over a long period of time. I know they've been doing it for a long period of time, but we're seeing colony losses of 50%. I know those numbers are not necessarily terribly solid, but we're seeing high numbers of colony losses. It's really about splitting hives and maintaining hives and focus on pollination and almonds. And I think Australia is a little bit more diverse in our income streams coming in for our beekeepers. I don't really see a time in the future where our Australian beekeepers are going to be solely reliant on pollination as their primary source of income across the majority of beekeepers. There will be some, but the majority. I think honey is always going to play a really critical role. And as such, we do a lot of work around value adding our honey. So rather than just producing a table honey that just goes straight to the supermarket shelf, we do a lot of work around Manuka honey. We do a lot of work around leatherwood and jarrah, and differentiating between our honeys and looking at the chemistry and the medicinal values of those honeys, where I don't really see that happening a lot in the US. Honey seems to be a bit of a secondary income source and a secondary product. that gets treated as a bit more of a commodity than what we
I think it also relates to the fact that the honey prices are fairly low. They just don't have the incentive to try and make anything special out of it. But yeah, anyways, my favorite Australian honey so far, I don't think I've tasted everything, but it's the yellow box.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, Danny, so thank you so much for all this information. I want to move to our last segment of this. This is somewhat of a recurring segment that I do every episode. It's called 60 Seconds Between the Rows. We're literally between the rows of canola here. It's going to be a few quick questions, quick answers. Don't overthink any of them. I'm going to try not to get you in trouble. Some of those are fairly controversial. So I'll start with the first one that is very controversial in Australia. Vegemite or Marmite?
Oh, Vegemite, 100%.
Okay. Bush or beach?
Beach.
Well, you live there. Favorite Aussie animal?
Probably a kangaroo.
Okay. Best kind of Australian-made honey?
Citrus honey is my favourite.
Okay. One Aussie innovation the world should copy?
I think some of our remoteness has promoted connectivity innovation in Australia. So it'd be some of our connectivity technology that we've got for our big farms that should be pushed across the world.
Fantastic. And then one thing you would borrow from US beekeeping?
From US beekeeping, I'd love to have the opportunities they have around pollination to be able to achieve year-round pollination, which would just diversify the income a bit more for our beekeepers.
Okay. First job you ever had in agriculture?
So my first agricultural job was growing genetically modified canola for Bayer Crop Science in the contra season for the Canada season in Australia, back before GM was allowed in Australia. So it was very regulated and very exciting.
Right. What's more challenging, being a beekeeper or doing what you do today?
Doing what I do today, without a doubt. Much easier to wrangle a box of bees than a box full of beekeepers, I can tell you.
Right. I think for the next one, I already know the answer because I've seen your garage. Toyota Hilux or Ford Ranger?
A Hilux every day.
And last one, best spot in Australia for camping?
York Peninsula,
Okay.
where I live, mate. How can you beat this weather? Perfectly still, sunny, and we have some of the most pristine beaches in Australia that we can still drive our vehicles and camp on.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Danny, it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for sharing your perspective on agriculture in Australia and beekeeping. This thing, I think, shut off.
It's had enough of life.
Yeah. I'm going to continue with your one, I think.
You want to swap seats? Just sit there, and then you can.
This is real life problems here. So again, thank you for all your insights and your perspective on Australian agriculture and beekeeping, and helping us better understand the fascinating world of bees here down under. That's it for this episode of Between the Rows. I'm Itai Kanot. Thanks for being here and for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.